The wind across the high plains was a lonely sound, a constant whisper of all that was lost. Elias Thorne knew its language. It spoke of dust and drought, of endings. It had been the same wind that carried the scent of wood smoke from his chimney the day he buried his wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Lily. Now, 2 years on, the wind was just the sound of the silence in his sprawling, empty house. He rode the fence line not because the wire needed mending, but because the routine was a bulwark against memory. The steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the dry earth was a metronome counting out the empty seconds of his life. His gaze, accustomed to the vast, stark beauty of the landscape, snagged on something ugly. The Kane place. A blight on the horizon, a collection of leaning sheds and a shack that looked more like a heap of refuse than a home. Silas Kane was a mean drunk, a man whose soul had curdled long ago. Elias kept his distance. He had enough ghosts of his own without inviting in his neighbor's demons. But then he heard it. Not the wind, but a different kind of keening. A man's guttural roar, followed by the sharp, terrified squawk of chickens. Elias reined in his horse, his body tensing. He was a man who had made a covenant with indifference, a promise to the universe to simply be left alone in his grief. Yet, he watched. From the shack stumbled Silas, dragging a slip of a girl by a fistful of matted hair. She couldn't have been more than 12, her body a collection of sharp angles and jutting bones beneath a filthy sackcloth dress. She didn't scream or fight. Her silence was more unnerving than any cry, a hardened, brittle thing. With a final curse, Silas threw her into the chicken coop, the door slamming shut on a cloud of feathers and dust. He secured it with a thick wooden bar. There, Silas roared to the uncaring sky. Sleep with the filth you are. He staggered back toward his shack, leaving the girl to the frantic clucking and the ammonia stink of the enclosure. Elias sat motionless on his horse, the sun beating down on him. The image was seared into his mind, the girl's small, pale face peering through the chicken wire, her eyes as dark and vacant as a starless night. He saw not just a neighbor's cruelty, but a desecration. In his mind, a phantom memory surfaced with agonizing clarity, Lily, his Lily, with her clean nightgown and bright eyes, tucked into a warm bed, her small hand clutching his finger. He had read her stories of valiant knights and faraway queens. He had promised her she would always be safe. A promise broken by a fever he was powerless to fight. Now, watching the girl in the coop, a different kind of powerlessness washed over him, but this one felt wrong. It was a choice. To ride on, to retreat back into the curated emptiness of his ranch, or to, what? What could one broken man do against the ugliness of the world? Night fell. A sliver of moon offered no comfort, only making the shadows deeper. From his porch, Elias could still see the Kane place, a smudge of deeper darkness against the plains. He imagined the girl, huddled on the shit straw floor, the chickens pecking and rustling around her. He imagined her cold. He imagined her fear. And for the first time in 2 years, the grief in his chest shifted, making room for something else. A cold, quiet rage. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of his empty house. It no longer sounded like loneliness. It sounded like an accusation. And as he stared out into the oppressive dark, he knew his covenant with indifference had been broken. The fence line between his world and hers had become more than just wire and posts. It was a line he would have to cross. The sun rose with a brutal, indifferent glare, baking the dust on Elias's ranch into a fine powder. Sleep had not come. The image of the girl in the coop was a brand on the inside of his eyelids. He moved through his morning chores with the precision of a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. He milked the cow, fed the horses, checked the well. Each task was a familiar anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. But the water in the bucket felt different. The hay in his hands felt different. It all felt like a luxury, an obscene comfort in the face of the squalor just beyond his property line. He looked at the food in his larder, smoked ham, sacks of flour, jars of preserves Sarah had put up the summer before she'd gone. It was a testament to a life that had once been full. Now it felt like hoarding. He sliced a thick loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days prior, its crust still crisp. He filled a clean canteen with fresh, cool water from the well. He found a thick wool blanket, one they used to take for picnics by the creek, and folded it neatly. He did not know what he was doing, not really. It was not a plan, but an impulse, a deep, resonant pull from a part of him he thought had died with his family. He rode not along the fence line this time, but straight for it. Silas Kane's wagon was gone. Elias had seen it rattling toward town earlier, a journey that meant Silas wouldn't be back until his whiskey money ran out. The Kane shack was silent, a study in neglect. The windows were grime-caked eyes staring at nothing. The yard was a litter of broken tools and empty bottles. And then he saw the coop. The girl, Ilara, was still inside. She was huddled in a corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her face turned away from the entrance. A small boy, younger, maybe 7, sat on the dirt near the coop, silent as a stone. He clutched a small, crudely carved piece of wood in his hand. He watched Elias approach with wide, wary eyes, the eyes of a rabbit that knows the hawk is circling. Elias dismounted, his movement slow, deliberate. He did not want to spook them. They looked like feral creatures, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. He approached the fence that separated his land from theirs, a stretch of sagging wire and rotting posts. He didn't speak. Words felt loud, intrusive. Instead, he hung the canteen and the sack with the bread on a fence post. He laid the folded blanket carefully over the top rail. He looked at the children. The boy, Finn, just stared, unblinking. The girl, Ilara, slowly turned her head. Her eyes met his. They were not vacant, as he'd first thought. They were fiercely intelligent, burning with a suspicion so profound it was almost a physical force. She was assessing him. A threat? A trick? Elias held her gaze for a long moment, trying to pour every ounce of his intent through his eyes. I am not him. I mean you no harm. Then he turned, swung himself back onto his horse, and rode away without a backward glance. The next day, he did the same. And the day after. The canteen and the sack were always empty when he returned. The blanket was gone. On the 4th day, he brought his tools. He began to mend the fence between their properties. He dug new post holes in the hard, unforgiving earth. He stretched the wire taut, its sharp barbs glinting in the sun. It was hard work, grounding work. It was an act of separation and an act of connection all at once. He was building a better wall, a stronger boundary, but he was doing it on their border. He was a constant, quiet presence. The children watched him. Ilara would sometimes emerge from the coop during the day, now that Silas was gone, but she never strayed far from it. It was her prison, but it was also her territory. Finn remained her silent shadow. They were a unit of 2, a tiny, wounded pack. One afternoon, as he was stapling a section of wire, he saw the boy, Finn, had crept closer. He was a dozen yards away, half hidden behind a scrubby bush. Elias stopped his work. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an apple, shiny and red. He set it on top of a fence post, then went back to his hammering, pretending not to notice. He heard the faint sound of bare feet on dry dirt. When he glanced back, the apple was gone. A small victory. A crack in the wall of their fear. He was packing his tools as the sun began to bleed across the horizon when he saw the dust cloud. A single rider, coming fast from town. It was Silas Kane, slumped in his saddle, swaying with drink. Elias's gut tightened. He watched as Silas reined his horse in, his bleary eyes struggling to focus. He saw Elias. He saw the mended fence. Then his gaze fell upon the clean canteen hanging from a post, a stark symbol of another man's intervention. Silas's face, already slack with liquor, hardened into a mask of pure, possessive malice. He slid from his horse, stumbling, and his eyes locked on Elias, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The fragile peace of the last few days evaporated into the dry desert air, replaced by the suffocating certainty of violence. Silas Kane stumbled across the cracked earth, his progress unsteady but fueled by a potent mix of whiskey and rage. Thorn, he slurred, spitting the name like a curse. What in the hell you think you're doing on my property? Elias remained by the fence, his tools gathered at his feet. He stood tall, his posture unyielding, a stark contrast to Cain's shambling form. Mending my fence, Silas. It was in poor shape. His voice was low and even, betraying none of the cold tension coiling in his stomach. Silas laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Your fence. He gestured wildly at the taut new wire. Looks like you're mighty interested in what's on this side of it. His gaze shifted, landing on Elara, who had frozen near the coop, and Finn, who had darted behind her, a small hand gripping the back of her tattered dress. Silas's eyes narrowed into cruel slits. He saw the empty sack that had held the bread. He saw the lingering shape of the blanket now clutched in Elara's arms. You been feedin' her my stock, Thorn? The question was thick with insinuation, reducing his children to the level of livestock. Elias's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He forced them to relax. They looked hungry, their mind to look after, Silas snarled, taking a menacing step toward Elara. Or not. It ain't your concern. He reached out and grabbed the girl's arm, his fingers digging into her thin bicep. She flinched but made no sound, her face a mask of stoic endurance. It was a look Elias was coming to understand. It was the armor of the perpetually damned. She's got chores, Silas growled, yanking her toward the shack. Been lazened about long enough. The sight of that brute hand on that child's arm snapped something inside Elias. The carefully constructed wall around his heart, the one built of grief and solitude, crumbled to dust. Let her go, Silas. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a final warning. Silas stopped, turning to look at Elias with genuine surprise, which quickly curdled back into a sneer. What did you say to me? I said, let her go. Elias took a step forward, away from the safety of his own property. He was crossing the line, in every sense of the word. I'll give you $100, Elias said, the offer tasting like ash in his mouth. For both of them, Silas stared, his drunken mind struggling to process the offer. He looked from Elias's determined face to the two children huddled together like frightened quail. A slow, greedy smile spread across his lips. He saw not a savior, but a fool. He saw not a rescue, but a transaction. 100, he scoffed. They're my blood. Worth more than that. 200. Cash. He was selling his own children. The casual depravity of it stole the air from Elias's lungs. He thought of the money he had saved, money that no longer had a purpose. It was for a future that had died with Lily. Perhaps this was its new purpose. Fine, Elias agreed, the word clipped. 200. I'll get it from my house. But they come with me now. Silas's grip on Elara loosened. He shoved her toward Elias. Go on then. Get out of my sight. He looked at Elias, his eyes glinting with triumph. You bring that money back here by sunrise, or I'll fetch the sheriff and claim you stole my kin. Elara stumbled, but didn't fall. She grabbed Finn's hand, her knuckles white. She looked at Elias, her expression unreadable. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was a deep, bottomless well of uncertainty. What new hell was this? Elias turned and led them across the fence line, onto his land. The children followed a few paces behind, their bare feet scuffing in the dust. The silence was absolute. When they reached his house, solid and clean and utterly alien to them, they stopped at the porch as if they'd hit an invisible wall. Elias opened the door. The inside smelled of clean wood and old books, a stark contrast to the stench of rot they were used to. You can come in, he said softly. They hesitated, then Elara, ever the protector, pulled Finn with her over the threshold. They stood just inside, small and lost in the large, quiet room. Elias watched them, a profound ache in his chest. He had bought them. He had used the language of the man who hurt them, the language of ownership. How could he ever undo that? He led them down the hall to a closed door. He pushed it open. The room inside was pristine, untouched. A small bed with a handmade quilt. A rocking horse in the corner. A shelf of children's books. It was Lily's room. A shrine to a ghost. Elara and Finn stared into the room, their eyes wide. They were not looking at a bedroom, they were looking at a life they couldn't possibly comprehend. Elara took a half step back, her suspicion returning full force, sharper than before. This place was not safe. It was just a different kind of cage. The days that followed were a delicate, silent ballet of tentative gestures and profound distrust. Elara and Finn moved through Elias's house like ghosts, flinching at sudden movements, speaking only to each other in hushed whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. They slept in Lily's room, but not in the bed. Elias found them in the mornings curled together on the floor in a corner, Elara's arm thrown protectively over her brother, the blanket he'd given them their only shield. He didn't force the issue. He simply left the door open, a quiet signal that they were not trapped. He had paid Silas the $200, the exchange a grim, silent affair at sunrise on the fence line. Silas had snatched the money and left without a word, leaving Elias feeling hollowed out, as if he'd participated in something deeply profane. Now, the children were his responsibility, but they were not his. They were their own, a tightly wound knot of trauma and survival he didn't know how to begin to untangle. He fell back on what he knew, routine and work. He showed them the vegetable garden, its neat rows a stark contrast to the chaotic weeds of the Kane place. He demonstrated how to pull a carrot from the earth, how to brush off the dirt. Finn watched with intense curiosity, but Elara's gaze was fixed on Elias's hands, as if expecting them to strike at any moment. Elias moved slowly, deliberately. He never raised his voice. He never stood too close. He was trying to teach them the language of safety, a dialect they had never heard. One afternoon, he found Finn tracing the lines of the old rocking horse with a hesitant finger. Elias went to his workshop and returned with a small block of soft pine and his own carving knife, its blade worn smooth with use. He sat on the floor a careful distance from the boy. Without a word, he began to shave thin curls of wood from another block. He was carving a bird, its wings outstretched. Finn watched, his eyes mesmerized by the transformation. After a while, Elias held out the block of pine and the small knife to the boy. Finn looked at his sister. Elara gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The boy took the offering, his small hands treating the tools with a reverence that touched something deep inside Elias. For Elara, he offered something different. He saw her shivering one morning, though the air was warm, her threadbare dress offering no comfort. He went to the chest at the foot of his own bed, the one that held Sarah's and Lily's things he hadn't been able to bring himself to touch. He pulled out a simple cotton dress, a soft blue, the one Lily had worn on her last good day. It was clean. It was whole. He laid it on the kitchen table while Elara was outside. He said nothing. When she came back in, she stopped dead, her eyes fixed on the garment. She approached it slowly, as if it were a sleeping animal. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the fabric, her fingers tracing the stitched hem. It was the softest thing she had ever felt. That evening, she emerged from the bedroom wearing it. The dress was a little too big, but on her, it looked less like clothing and more like a prayer. For the first time, she spoke a word directly to him, her voice raspy from disuse. "Why?" Elias was mending a leather strap by the low fire. He looked up at her, this fierce, wounded child bathed in the warm light, and the answer came to him, simple and true. "Because you're not an animal," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You're a child. You deserve to be clean and warm." A flicker of something, not trust, not yet, but something less sharp than fear, passed through her eyes. In the following weeks, the silence in the house began to change. It was less a silence of fear and more one of contemplation. They ate at the big wooden table, the scrape of cutlery the only sound. Finn was always carving, his little hawk becoming more defined each day. Elara started helping in the garden without being asked, her movements becoming more confident. A fragile, unspoken peace began to settle over the three of them. They were three solitary islands beginning to form an archipelago. This delicate peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider from town. Not Silas, but a boy from the mercantile. He carried a letter. It was folded and sealed, addressed to Elias Thorne. His name was written in a precise, bureaucratic script. He opened it. The words were cold and official. Sheriff Brody requested his presence in town concerning a formal complaint filed by Mr. Silas Kane. The complaint alleged the abduction of his 2 children, Ilara and Finn Kane. The law, the letter stated, recognized Silas Kane as their legal guardian. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over Elias. He had bought them, but he did not own them. In the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the law, he was a kidnapper, and Silas, their tormentor, was their rightful father. He looked up from the letter and saw Ilara standing in the doorway, watching him. She had seen the rider. She had seen the letter. And on her face was the old, familiar expression, the grim certainty that any good thing was merely a prelude to a greater pain. The air in Sheriff Brody's office was stale, smelling of old paper and lukewarm coffee. It was a room that dealt in facts, not feelings, a place where the messy complexities of human lives were flattened into neat lines in a ledger. Brody himself was a man who seemed to have been born middle-aged, his face set in a permanent expression of weary authority. He looked at Elias from across his wide, cluttered desk, his gaze devoid of sympathy. "Thorne," he said, his voice flat. "This is an irregular situation." Elias stood before the desk, his hat in his hands. He felt the familiar weight of helplessness, the same feeling that had consumed him as he'd watched the fever take his family. They were being mistreated, Sheriff. The girl was sleeping in a chicken coop, Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "I've known Silas Kane my whole life. He's a drunk and he's mean, I'll grant you that. But those children are his. The law is clear on that. A father has rights, and what about their rights?" Elias's voice was a low growl, the quiet fury from the fence line returning. "The right not to be starved? Not to be treated worse than cattle? That's for him to decide," Brody said, his tone dismissive. He picked up a pen, tapping it on the blotter. "He says you came onto his land and took them. He says you stole his property." The word hung in the air, vile and obscene. "They ain't property," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. Brody looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "That's a fine sentiment, Thorne. But it's not a legal argument. He wants them back. And unless you can prove he's unfit in a court of law, which takes time and money you probably don't have, I have to see that they're returned to him." "You can't," Elias said. "It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. You can't send them back there. My hands are tied," Brody said, the classic excuse of a man unwilling to act. "I'll ride out to your place tomorrow at noon. Have the children ready. If you cooperate, we can keep this civil. If you don't." He let the threat hang unfinished. Elias walked out of the office and into the harsh sunlight of the street, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. The law. A tool that could be as cruel and unthinking as the man who wielded it. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of his life. Every hoofbeat was a countdown to the end of the fragile piece he had built. When he arrived, Ilara and Finn were on the porch. They knew. They didn't need to be told. The fear was back in their eyes, stark and absolute. That night, no one slept. Elias sat in his chair by the cold hearth, a shotgun resting across his lap. He wasn't sure what he intended to do with it, but its solid weight was a comfort. He looked around the room, at the life he had offered these children, a life of quiet dignity. He saw Finn's half-finished hawk on the mantelpiece. He saw the blue dress, now washed and hanging by the stove to dry. These were not just objects. They were symbols of a promise. A promise of safety. A promise he was not willing to break. The next day dawned grey and overcast, the sky a mirror of his mood. As midday approached, two riders appeared on the horizon. Sheriff Brody and, beside him, Silas Kane. Silas wore a look of smug, vindictive triumph. He had won. The law was his weapon, and he was about to use it to reclaim what was his. Elias stepped onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. Elara and Finn huddled in the doorway behind him, a single, trembling entity. Brody and Silas reined in their horses a few yards from the house. "Thorn," Brody said, his voice strained. "Don't make this difficult. The law's the law." "The children go with their father," Silas smirked, his eyes gleaming with a sick pleasure. "Come on now, Elara. Your pa is here to take you home." He said the word home as if it were a sanctuary, not a hell. It was then that Elias made his stand. He didn't raise the gun. He simply stood his ground, a lone, broken man forming a human shield. "No," he said, his voice ringing with a finality that made even the horses shift uneasily. He looked past the sheriff, past Silas, and spoke directly to the two children behind him. His voice softened, filled with a raw, aching sincerity. "You belong with me now." Silas dismounted, his face flushing with rage. "They belong to me. I'll take what's mine." He started for the porch, his hand outstretched to grab Elara. Elias's knuckles whitened on the stock of the gun. The world seemed to slow down, the air thick with imminent violence. But before Elias could raise the weapon, before Brody could intervene, something shifted. It was Elara. She stepped out from behind Elias, placing herself between him and her father. She was no longer the silent, feral creature from the coop. She was wearing the blue dress. Her face, though pale with fear, was set with a resolve that defied her years. She looked straight at Silas, her voice not loud, but so clear and steady it cut through the tension like a razor. "He never broke my back," she said, her words a stunning indictment. Her gaze flicked to Brody, then back to the man who had sired her. "But you did." Every day she took a breath, the first full, unafraid breath of her life. "He made me sleep with the chickens. He sold my mother's locket for whiskey. He called me filth." She didn't cry. Her words were stones, hard and heavy with truth. At that moment, Finn stepped forward too, standing beside his sister. He held up the wooden bird he had carved, now finished. It was a hawk, its wings spread, its eyes fierce. He didn't point it at Silas. He held it out toward Elias, an offering. A choice. A declaration. Sheriff Brody stared, his bureaucratic indifference finally pierced by the undeniable truth. He saw not a property dispute, but two children making a stand for their very souls. He saw Elias Thorne, a grieving man who had found a reason to live by refusing to let others die. He saw Silas Kane for what he was, a hollow, cruel man, a father in name only. The law might be the law, but justice, he realized, was something else entirely. He turned his horse, blocking Silas's path. "Get off this property, Kane," Brody said, his voice carrying a new, hard edge of authority. "I heard the girl. You come near these children again, the law you're so fond of will be the least of your worries." Silas stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. He looked from the sheriff's implacable face to the three figures on the porch, a fortress he could not breach. Defeated, he spat on the ground, mounted his horse, and rode away, a dwindling figure of hate against the vast plains. The three of them remained on the porch, the silence no longer empty, but full of everything that had just happened. Elias rested a hand on Elara's shoulder, and this time, she did not flinch. The sky began to clear, a sliver of sun breaking through the clouds, bathing the ranch in a soft, hopeful light. They were not a family born of blood, but one forged in fire, a broken man and two wounded souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. What do you think happens to this new family? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.